Welcome to this week's Squiggly Career Podcast. I'm Helen Tupper, one of the co-founders of Amazing If, and I'm here as ever with Sarah Ellis, the other co-founder.
Hello, everybody.
And if you don't already know, if you're new to Amazing If and the Squiggly Career Podcast, probably to tell you a little bit about us. So Amazing If has been running as a business for about 5 years. It's our 5-year anniversary this year. We're very proud.
We're going to have cake. I hope we're going to have cake.
I hope we're going to have cake. Get cake booked. I'll have some kind of healthy cake.
And I won't.
So maybe we'll have a big birthday party, the birthday edition of the podcast. One to think on. But our mission in all of those 5 years has been to help develop the skills so that people can succeed in what we call a squiggly career. And a squiggly career is something that we know a lot of people find quite challenging. And a squiggly career is really what a lot of us are dealing with now. It's one that has got lots of change. We're often now moving from industry to industry, company to company. We're staying in jobs for a shorter time than before. We're also just sort of doing lots of different job styles. There's freelance, part-time, lots of people are doing different things, starting their own businesses, and all of that makes up a squiggly career. And squiggly careers are great because they've got loads of opportunity in them, but they can also be a bit daunting if you've not got some of the skills to help you to succeed in them. And that's what we're all about. We're all about giving people practical help and advice to help you to succeed in a squiggly career. So that's probably enough about us. Sarah, what is it that we're going to talk about in this week's episode?
So this week we're going to talk about something called Imposter Syndrome, which I think most people will be pretty familiar with. But essentially it's the fear of being found out. And I was looking at some research today, actually, in preparation for having our kind of conversation this evening. And it shows that 70% of people at some point in their career will experience imposter syndrome in some way, shape or form. And actually there's a correlation in terms of, almost ironically, I think, the more you progress in your career, the more senior you come, actually, the more likely you are to experience imposter syndrome. And I think that's because often you get into bigger jobs or bigger roles and people start to go, oh, can I actually do this? Am I as good as I thought I was? And some of the things that I think you hear a lot, we've said certainly, and you think are things like, I don't deserve to be here. This is more by luck than by my skill. I'm not as good as people say I am. You don't give yourself credit for your own successes. You often actually associate your success with things that are outside of your control. And so I think at some point, most of us feel that sense of familiarity with going, or am I going to get found out? Is something going to happen that will just make me feel a bit like a fraud? Is it something you experience? Because I guess people often listen to us, I suppose, we're doing a podcast on careers and think, well, maybe they're both pretty confident. This is not something that's relevant to Sarah and Helen.
Yeah, do you know what? And I think there's a bit of almost like an Instagram effect to careers now where people might think you've got it all sorted because it's like you've got a certain job and it looks like you're really calm. But I actually think that 70% stat, that just goes to show that that's not always really true. And it doesn't mean people are they're hiding their failures. But I think what it does mean is that people aren't 100% confident all the time.
Yeah.
In fact, the majority, 70% of people are not confident all the time. They've got these thoughts about, am I able to do this? What are people thinking about my capability? I'm going to get found out, all that stuff. And so absolutely, I suffer from it. I'm the other 30% of people who don't have it at all. I quite envy them. I think for me, there are definitely certain triggers, and there have probably been points in my career and also my life that have triggered that more, like the first time I became a manager, coming back to work after maternity leave, which I'll probably talk a little bit more about because I think that's quite a significant one.
Yeah.
I've moved companies quite a lot, and every time I've moved company, I've generally actually moved industry at the same time I've moved company, and that has also been a quite a big thing for me, a big trigger of I'm in this role at the same level or a more senior level than I was in my last company, yet I know far less than everybody around me. And so absolutely I have had that in my career, and there's probably been times when as a result of that I've not been quite as effective as I would have liked, because I think it's probably held me back in some ways.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the final point before we perhaps start sharing a bit about how it's impacted us is, like, why should you care about this? Why should you care about overcoming imposter syndrome and that fear of being found out? And I was reflecting on this and thinking, it's so important in squiggly careers and in our squiggly world that you're clear about the value that you add and the impact that you have in an organisation, but just generally, because we're all going to move around more in terms of roles and opportunities and different styles of working, as you said, actually you've got to take all of that really great stuff with you. And what you don't want to take with you is a continual sense of a fear of being found out, because that will never be you doing your best work. So that's what would worry me about if somebody's perpetually going, oh, that's what's really concerning me, that's what's taking up my mental energy. Actually, then you're not giving yourself the freedom to be brilliant. And this can be really all-consuming, I think, for some people I've spoken to, people I've coached, where, you know, this real anxiety starts to be quite overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think you just don't do certain things as a result. You know, if you're scared of being found out, you know, that example I said about I've changed industries and I'm scared that people think I won't know enough, it means that you're probably not asking insightful questions. You know, I often ask questions that I think people must think I just really don't know what I'm doing. But so I'll ask someone about what's the actual objective here, or what are we trying to do?
Yeah.
And I think they're the simplest of questions, but you have to be really confident to ask them.
Yeah.
And because if you've got imposter syndrome, those are the sorts of questions that you think, oh, I can't ask that because it's going to make me look like I don't know anything. Whereas I actually think sometimes those really simple questions, if you're confident enough to ask them, they're sometimes the most valuable questions to put into a room, because a lot of the time, and that is a value that you can add when you're new. So you're carrying this assumption that I can't ask those questions like, why are we all in here? Do we all need to be in this meeting? What's the point of it? You know, really basic questions, because you think,
though if somebody said that to me at the start, what's the point of this? I think I'd be like, don't know, to have a chat.
Like I said, but I sometimes do ask those questions, not in an aggressive way, but just, you know, what is it we're trying to achieve here? We've got now, but that's because, you know, I don't have that as an imposter. I have other things for my imposter syndrome, definitely, but that one's not. But I guess my point is that when you have these imposter syndromes, you don't do something as a result. You don't ask a question. You don't you don't show your cards. You know, the first time you've been a manager, you might not admit that because you're like, oh, I don't want anyone to know that. But as a result of that, you're not vulnerable, or you're not challenging, or you're not curious, because you're stopping all of those behaviours to sort of present a bit of a front, you know, present the Instagram version of yourself.
Yeah, and I think that point on questions, you've actually stolen my thunder a little bit there, Helen, just to be clear. That is, I think, one of my behaviours in terms of imposter syndrome, particularly when I'm with people who I think know different things to me. And I sometimes associate people knowing different things to me as being smarter than me, and kind of going, well, because they're better at some things that I just know I'm not as good at, those people are smarter. And then if I'm sitting in a room with them and I'll think, well, I don't really understand, or I don't know the answer to this, I don't ask a question. And that's because and I think what I'm doing there, well, I know what I'm doing there is protecting myself, because I'll think, oh, they'll judge me. You know, they'll be sitting there and going, I can't believe she just asked that question. In her job, she should know the answer to that question. Or, oh, if she was a bit smarter, she'd know the answer to that question. And I was thinking about like why that really impacts me. And I think it goes back to, I don't like not being right. I don't like not knowing the right answer. At school, I was the kid who I would only put my hand up if I knew I was right. And I hated putting my hand up if I was ever wrong. And so the idea of asking a question that might make you look a bit stupid, or it shows vulnerability, doesn't it? Like showing vulnerability. Not all the time. This is definitely in specific instances for me. That has taken quite a lot of practice, because then obviously once I learned about growth mindset, which is all we ever talk about every single week, if you are playing your growth mindset drinking game right now, please take a drink. I think quite a lot of people listen to this at like 8 o'clock in the morning, so maybe take a sip of latte. When you learn about growth mindset, you realise actually by me not asking those questions, that's a really fixed mindset attitude. They were often my moments in a week where I'd be really fixed mindset, because I was protecting myself. I wasn't being curious. I was limiting my own potential and my own ability to learn. And as you said, some of those simple, straightforward questions, it's a classic thing, isn't it? You always hear people say, if you've got the question, somebody else has probably got the question. But I always sit there and think, why isn't somebody else asking it then? If someone else has also got it, why am I the one who has to ask it? But you realise that actually you'll say something and then actually someone else will say, oh yeah, that would be useful to understand. And it just makes you feel that bit better or a bit more confident. And ultimately I rationalise it with, if I want to add as much impact as I possibly can in my role, be as valuable as possible in any job that I'm doing, if I don't understand something, then that's really important that I make sure I do, because then I can do a better job. But also, if I think about the behaviours that I want to role model as a leader, I don't want people to sit in meetings and feel like they can't ask what they might consider to be a stupid question just because, you know, they think other people are smarter than them, or because they want to try and protect themselves, because that's just not how you learn, is it? So the way I force myself is thinking about what I sort of expect and want of other people, and I think you've got to role model that. So that's how I hold myself to account.
I think that's a really nice way of reframing it, so that it's not about you anymore. Suddenly this is not just about you holding yourself back. This is about actually potentially you holding other people back, because suddenly, there's this role modeling thing of other people following your lead, particularly if you're a manager, actually. How are you helping them to grow and develop?
Yeah, exactly. And then my second example of imposter syndrome, as I was thinking about this, is almost a retrospective example of where I worked out that, honestly, every time I go into a new role, I reflect back on the previous job and think, oh, I probably did that for like just enough time that no one ever found me out. And I've not really thought about it that much before today, when I was thinking about useful examples to share with everyone. And honestly, I think I have a bit of an attitude of sometimes thinking, oh, I'm doing a new role now. Oh, that last one just about worked out, rather than thinking, oh, like I've been promoted, or that was a really useful couple of years of experience. I almost breathe a slight sigh of relief, I think, and go, oh, I sort of made it through that role. And that's actually something I'd not quite thought about that much until I'd started thinking about imposter syndrome. But it's almost this attitude of going, well, it's a survival thing, the kind of fight or flight thing. It's like I survived it and it all seemed to go okay. And back to that thing of you don't like own your successes or take credit for your successes. Yeah. Usually, actually, I'm pretty good at demonstrating and being confident in saying, these are my successes in a role. So because I'm quite achievement focused, I can usually articulate to people I'm working for or with, say, oh, in the past 6 months I've done X, Y, Z. But almost in a less specific setting, I actually almost diminish that success and give myself less credit for success in a role, and just sort of go, oh yeah, I made my way through that, and then, on to the next thing before it's all falls apart. And it's sort of slightly like disaster planning. I don't quite know what I think will happen if I stay in that job for 1 more month. But it's just
that is so funny.
It's a funny mentality that I think, rather than like almost owning the positives from a job, and the kind of overall positive experience, because I'm quite forward facing, I kind of look on to the next thing and almost stop giving myself credit for the things I've done previously. Does that make any sense?
Do you know what? We've never talked about that before.
No.
And I have exactly the same thing. It's really interesting.
Really?
Because, yeah, I have exactly the same thing. That, oh gosh, yeah, I just about left that one and they still thought I was okay.
Yeah.
It's exactly, that's a definite confidence gremlin for us to explore together a little bit more. But I think it just goes to show, we've worked in lots of different companies, and now, I think we're at a relatively strong point in our careers, and we are still thinking that, I will still think, when I leave my role, I did it just in time before they still thought I was good. And it's that, you're right, it's a complete wrong way of thinking. And I think this is all, loads of this stuff is just reframing, this imposter syndrome. Once you understand that the majority of people have it, and that actually it's based on assumptions, the way that you get around this is, the first thing is that you're aware of it, and the second thing is that you kind of do something about it. And I think reframing it, and so in that situation you're thinking, actually, what are all the good stuff that I've done that is really good, and in how many jobs have I done that good stuff? Actually, that must mean I'm quite good at that thing.
There's a pattern here.
There's a pattern
that tells
here.
You something, yeah.
And it's not necessarily a pattern of failure. It's a pattern of, I've repeatedly achieved this in the different companies I've been in. And you can take some confidence from that, and hopefully a bit of objectivity, because I think some of this imposter syndrome is much more tied up in your perception of yourself, your fears, your worry, than what other people think of you.
And you mentioned before about coming back to work after mat leave, and I guess relevant for anyone who decides to take a break of any type, because I think I'm seeing more and more now people taking career breaks for lots of reasons, to go travelling, to take some time out to care for somebody. So this is really about kind of returning to work after a break. How did that kind of manifest itself for you then in terms of maybe having a bit of kind of a fear of being found out or imposter syndrome?
Well, I've had the mat leave thing twice. So the first time I was working,
that is because you've got 2 kids, Helen.
I've had 2 children. Yes,
You're like, it's happened twice.
I've had this mat leave thing. That's the outcome has been 2 children. Yeah. So the first time I was at Virgin, and I was working on a new business that Virgin was starting up at the time, and it was the context of that business was not something I'd experienced before. It was a startup. It was quite small. It was a very kind of tech business. It was about launching a new app, and so I'm not sure I 100% knew what I was doing before I went on maternity leave, but I had the period of time that I was off, and I came back and the business had moved on quite a lot, but everyone was looking for me because I hadn't actually been out for that long. They hadn't replaced me with somebody else, which even, if they had replaced me with someone else, that would have probably triggered a whole load of other imposter syndrome things. Yeah. But because they hadn't replaced me, it was almost like they saved things up for me with the expectation that I was going to come back and solve everything and get everything fixed. And I remember thinking, oh God, so many thoughts, can I do this job? They all know this detail now far more than me. When I first started that job, I was part of the team that set that business up. So I was so close to everything. And I suddenly thought, has my value depleted because I haven't got all the knowledge that I had? Also, I was putting some new boundaries around my time that I hadn't done before. I needed to get home so I could go get my children and put them to bed, and that hadn't been the case. So I suddenly wasn't working till 7:30 and 8 o'clock in the office at night anymore, and I had to leave at 5 o'clock. And so
shock horror.
I know, who knew? I do now leave the office at 5 o'clock to get home from my children.
Which is a good thing.
yeah, it's a good thing. It's a very important thing for me now anyway. But then that felt different, and my imposter syndrome was, oh, do they think I'm not as committed anymore?
Yeah.
And, I had absolutely no evidence of all of that. Like it was all internal. And my manager at the time, I remember him saying to me, Helen, I've never heard you say sorry as much. And, sometimes those people that gave you, it's really interesting. And it's sometimes people that give you that quite blunt feedback when, they're not, he probably didn't even mean it as a significant piece of feedback for me. But when he said it, I thought, oh, you're
apologising.
Right.
Yeah,
I'm apologising all the time because I feel like, oh, I've got to be this certain thing and I'm not that anymore, and I feel like I have to apologise. And like, they didn't need my apology. They thought I was doing an absolutely fine job. They were glad I was back. My role had been vacant for a number of months, and this was all an internal thing. And I think once I got that feedback, I thought, hang on a minute, like, take a step back. What have you got to bring to this challenge? Just go bring that. Don't obsess about what you don't know. Apply what you do know. And once I did that, it was a lot better. And then the second time I was on maternity leave, I was able to take some confidence in the fact that I'd been in a situation where I probably didn't know all the details, but I'd relied on what I was good at and what I did know. And actually that had been really valuable. And I think with imposter syndrome, that's a really important thing. Almost like the more you challenge your imposter syndrome, the more confident you become in dealing with it. So, the fact that I might have an imposter syndrome about not knowing enough, and I talked about those sort of silly questions I ask, I've asked those questions enough now to know that they add value in a room more than me sitting there and pretending that I know what other people are talking about. And just the fact that I've done it a few times, no one's looked at me like I'm a complete idiot. Yeah. They might be thinking it, but they've not looked at me like that. And people have said, oh, that was a really good question. I've just challenged my own assumptions so many times now that I feel much more comfortable doing it. I think that's what you've got to do with your imposter syndrome. Think about what it is, how it's holding you back, and poke it until it feels okay that you can work with it.
There are a couple of insights there actually I was thinking about as you were talking. One, somebody once said to me, actually in more of a work kind of marketing context, when people are explaining something to you, be really clear about whether it's a fact or an opinion. And when you're thinking about your imposter syndrome and your kind of general confidence gremlins, just try and work out whether whether it's something that's your opinion or is it a fact. Have you got any actual evidence to back up what it is that you're saying that you think is true? Because if you think about what you just described there was no facts to prove that after you came back from your first maternity leave, you weren't doing a good job. It was all your opinion. In your opinion, you were worried about these things. And then actually what becomes more factual is if you can get, either if you can reframe it for yourself, but also I thought just listening to you talk about the second time you went back, the value of feedback. getting small bits of feedback to just help to, I guess, positively affirm that actually maybe the thing you thought was true isn't. So there's almost the reframing that you can do yourself, and I don't think that's easy. I think it's easy to say, but I actually think it's really hard to do. But I wonder if it's often more powerful if it can start with some sort of prompt from someone else. You know, can you get some feedback? Can you, you don't have to say, I've got this real fear of being found out in my job. I just wondered if you thought I was any good at it. And, I'm not sure I'd kind of go that far. But what I would probably do is, let's say I was in a meeting where I thought, I'm in a meeting with people who are all smarter than me. And I did ask a few questions. I thought, all right, I'm going to make an effort to ask a few questions. Then asking somebody in that meeting to say, did you think those were useful questions? And there is a small question, but actually hearing then somebody go, I thought it really helped to move the conversation on, or it really helped to make sure that we'd really explored how we were going to achieve this, just not just what we were going to do, but how we were going to do it. Just that kind of positive feedback loop, I think, can be just really helpful to then build up kind of a really good bank of, these are the facts and I can do this and I shouldn't let this stuff hold me back.
Absolutely. I was just thinking when you were talking there about maybe something practical that I've done really recently, I was trying to think, what's a really recent imposter syndrome that I've had? And I'm organising this big thing at work at the moment. It's kind of like this event.
Taking over your life, isn't it?
Little bit.
A tiny bit.
Nearly over. In fact, it will be nearly over when this podcast goes live. But and it's all good, but it's quite consuming. And I definitely have when I was first working on it, I was sort of a little bit imposter syndrome, like, oh gosh, do I know enough about this? Do I know enough people? What if I drop a ball? All this kind of stuff. And it wasn't really, there's actually quite a lot to do, and it's not really helpful, my mind being distracted in that way. I actually just need to get on and make this all work. And so I happened to read a really good article. I put this on our Instagram stories actually, but I think in the lovely way Instagram stories work, it's deleted. So I'll repeat it here. There is a blogger and actually has a podcast, Tim Ferriss, and he talks about fear setting. And I'd heard about goal setting, but I'd not heard about fear setting. And the concept of it is you almost write down what's the worst that can happen in this situation and get it down on paper. And then you write down, well, what would I do about this in this situation? How would I mitigate it? So let's say the worst thing I thought I could happen was that I hadn't included somebody and they got really irritated. Well, okay, what would be my mitigation? I would apologise and I would have a ready-made set of information that I could send to them straight away, so that once I'd realised I hadn't included them, I was on the front foot with sorting it out. And actually, I really like that fear setting, like not ignoring it. That. Not letting it consume your mind, just getting it down on a piece of paper. And what triggered it is I have the notebook in front of me that has those things on it. And I was flicking through it this morning. I was like, I feel like I've got over it now. It was a bit of a moment in time when that imposter syndrome was just bubbling up. And I just wrote down, what am I actually really bothered about in this situation? What is this the worst outcome here? And just tried to flip it into, okay, if it does materialise, what am I going to do? And, it depends how your mind works, but I'm quite a practical person. And just having done that and got it on paper, got it out of my head, and I felt like I had some solutions to deal with this. And I think, again, if you're of a similar mindset, like you like practical things, you like a to-do list, you like a tick list, this is a really nice way of getting this imposter syndrome just out a little bit and just having some practical actions for it.
Yeah, it almost sounds negative to go, what's the worst that can happen? But actually it's really helpful because you often realise that the worst is not that bad.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And it's something that either, if you've articulated it, sometimes you can be proactive, I think, to mitigate it in the first place, or you can just respond and cope better if those things do happen. I think a few times where I've really been thrown in terms of kind of imposter syndrome is when maybe something has happened that, like you say, I haven't been prepared for, and then it's really kind of triggered it quite dramatically, and then you don't quite know, you don't know how to respond, and then you spend the whole next month beating yourself up because you didn't respond very well. It's like that thing of I could have said something loads better, or I could have acted or responded in a really different way, and you're beating yourself up about it. And if you're me, because I overthink everything, I just keep thinking about it. Whereas actually, if I'd have just thought beforehand, okay, if that thing happens, this is what I'll do. Even if I didn't do it in that moment, as you said, you then very quickly would have thought through. It's like kind of scenario planning, isn't it? I'd have thought you think through some kind of hypotheses and some scenarios. It's almost all the shades of grey of kind of what can happen in these instances where you might be under pressure.
In my corporate language, I'd be calling it a playbook. It's almost like your situational playbook. Yeah. But it's just, I think it's just so you feel like you're on the front foot and you've got it there. if you, it's sort of like a little confidence booster. If the worst happens, I know what I'm going to do, so I don't need to obsess about it, which is just, that's distracting you from applying your best work, really.
Should we do some hints and tips for people?
So aside from fear setting, that one's
which I guess is a hint and tip in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, so we've given you an extra one there. I think also this whole point around, when I was talking about when I was at Virgin, it really helped me to think about what value I was adding. Being a mentor can really help you to understand what value you add to people. So if you're not confident enough to go, here are 5 ways that I add value.
Yeah.
If you can't do that now, there are exercises that you can do where you can look at your strengths that we've talked about on previous podcasts. But one quite natural thing is just mentor people. Through the process of mentoring, you will realise, based on what people come to you for, what advice they come to you for when they're saying, oh, that's been really, really helpful, thank you. Those are the aspects in which you are adding value to somebody. And that, again, can give you confidence in these situations about what you can bring to them.
Yeah, and I think almost in addition to that, so you can be a mentor, also finding people, more senior people in different contexts to you, who maybe share your specific kind of imposter syndrome in terms of how you experience it, and then talk about how they've overcome it, because I think it's incredibly powerful. I've been to a few events certainly in earlier in my career, probably when I was about 5 or 6 years into my career, very senior women presenting and very transparently sharing their vulnerabilities, their imposter syndrome, their fear of being found out, and actually just hearing people at that level. So people who are chief executives, directors, in very busy, dynamic jobs, who on paper can just, look absolutely incredible. And there's always that I find that analogy quite interesting, the one of like the swan, people look like they're sort of gliding effortlessly through this like amazing job, and then when they reveal kind of often how they're feeling, or the kind of sense of agitation they have, it's like they're paddling like super fast underneath the water. I just found it really powerful to hear people talking in those kind of roles in a very open and honest way. And it made me realise, okay, well, when I experience it in whichever way I do, it's natural, it's understandable, and what you hear people talk about is you work on it. This is not something that you just overcome overnight. It's a constant, I don't want to use the word battle because that sounds like too hardcore, but I think it's just that it goes back to it. You are a constant work in progress. And whatever, you will always have these moments of thinking, oh, bit of a fear of found out, or that thing about, should I really be in this job? And that's natural. You don't beat yourself up about that. What you do is just make sure that it doesn't get in your way. I think that's the really critical thing. And
what other tips? So be a mentor is kind of as one.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, I read something really interesting about working out what type of imposter syndrome you experience. And I say we, maybe you, because you usually sort these things out. If I ask you on the podcast, that means you have to do it.
I am committed. I haven't quite said yes yet. Go on,
okay.
What do you need?
So just a link. So there's
just a link.
Yeah, there's a link to a really good article I found on Fast Company. I like Fast Company for various different articles on lots of different topics, but particularly I think they're good on leadership and ideas. And the article talks about there are 5 different types of imposter syndrome, and often you fit into a particular category, perhaps maybe slightly more than others. So there's one that's called, I think, the perfectionist, people who have set such a high bar for themselves, they just don't ever want to kind of make mistakes. They talked about one where it's like superwoman, superman type one, one about experts.
Which one were you?
I was actually a mixture of one or two of them. There wasn't one where I just thought, I'm only that one. But as part of the article, it asks you really good questions to say, does this apply to you? Ask yourself these questions. So, for example, on the one about being a perfectionist, it says, have you ever been accused of being a micromanager? Do you have difficulty delegating? If you miss the mark on something, do you accuse yourself of not being able to cut it? And do you feel like your work has to be 100% perfect? Now, being perfectly frank, I don't fit into that category.
Yeah,
because I am so far away from a perfectionist, it is untrue. So that's not really my issue. But I did find that I've worked with people and coached people where I can imagine them going, actually, yes, they would have had feedback around being, micromanaging. they would much rather control and have everything for themselves. So perhaps their imposter syndrome is around perfectionism. Some of the other ones are more applicable to me, but I remember reading that one and being like, I think I probably could do with a bit more of that some of the time. So
yeah, I'm going to do that afterwards.
Yeah, you should have a look. So that would be, I suppose, just it's not kind of a hint or a tip in a kind of specific way, but would be quite a useful action, I think, to take, is have a look at that and just work out what type of imposter syndrome do I have. Try and be more specific than just, fear of being found out or not being smart enough. Try and work out, I suppose it's the root cause of like why, ask yourself why 5 times. So why do I fear being found out? Why do I fear people not thinking I'm smart enough? What is it that's really driving this kind of insecurity, I guess, for a lot of people?
And maybe a last tip as well. I think we've talked about the value thing, but writing yourself a personal impact statement.
Yeah.
So this is you actually getting clear on a statement that partly you're happy to say to yourself, but ideally you're happy to say to other people about the value that you add, is so powerful. And it definitely starts with writing it down on paper so it feels authentic to you, and then just saying it to yourself so you kind of hold it a bit like a bit of a mantra about, the value that I add to this situation is, I can say confidently that I'm really good at bringing people together, creating a vision and motivating them to achieve it. I can say that really confidently. I can also say some of the things that I'm not very good at, but that's something that I know is true to myself, and I'd be happy, I've just said it to 20,000 people on a podcast.
Yeah.
So, I'm kind of happy to say that. So
I really hope they all like hold you to it. I hope they all come into contact with you at some point and be like, I'd just like you to show you that you can do this, please.
Just to create a vision and motivate us all to achieve it.
Right now, in the next 5 minutes.
On the spot. But in all seriousness, like, write something down that feels like you, and then just say it to yourself a little bit, because it's really useful in those situations, like in a new job when I'm going, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do here, I've never done in this situation. I can say, do you know what? I can bring people together, I can get a vision, I can motivate them to do it. That's got some value in of itself, despite the fact that I've no idea what all these acronyms mean and I don't know who's who.
Yeah.
So once, write it down for yourself and then start saying it to other people. And that's really powerful then, because other people can, share that for you. And again, that goes on to, strengths and building your brand, which we've talked about in other podcast episodes.
Yeah. And I think if you've not listened to some of the ones around strengths, the thing that's linked to the personal impact statement that I was going to suggest is if you write down at the end of every day for 7 days in a row, one success you've had that day, that just also helps with the kind of mindset and mentality of recognizing the value that you're adding, being clear about kind of the positive impact you're having day to day, because I think often people are really good at talking about very big projects or big moments in time where something has worked really well, but we forget all the in-between stuff. And as part of, I think, feeling like you're not going to get continually found out, if every day you think, well, not everything's perfect, but I know that today I did this really well, then that just kind of builds you up a bank of successes and confidence, and just helps you to remember, I think, those things when maybe you are under pressure or some of these things don't quite go to plan.
So some resources then. We've mentioned a few. So I feel like we've kind of talked about Tim Ferriss. We talked about the imposter syndrome thing on Fast Company, which I will tweet and link for everybody. I will do that. There you go.
I might just start doing this, with like everything that we need to do for Amazing If I just like mention on the podcast that you're going to do it, then I could just give you my to-do list. One other thing I did find that maybe as you're tweeting you could include, there's a good 9-question quiz that New York Magazine did. They have like a section called like the science of us. And it's actually a do you suffer from an imposter syndrome, and take a test. Now I love it is like a magazine test, to be clear, so this is not sort of an incredible psychology thing that takes ages. It's 9 questions. But it helps you again to just, I think, start to be a bit more forensic about where is it I need to improve. So some of the questions around things like, I'm worried people might not think I'm as capable as they think I am. It's hard for me to accept compliments. I feel my success has been more due to luck than my skills. So I think it's interesting to see which of the questions do you score really highly, and which do you say, oh, actually no, that one's not me. So that's not kind of challenge I have, because like all of these things, they're personal and unique to you. You have your own set of challenges to overcome, and they're different to different people. So that's the other thing I found that I thought might be useful for people.
And the only other thing probably worth mentioning is the very start of our series of podcasts was actually all on confidence.
Oh, yeah, that's true. We should probably mention that we did 10-part series.
We did 10-part series, and there's some like mini ones as top tips that are all on specific things that might trigger your imposter syndrome. So I think there's one on you're too young. I think there's one on you don't know enough.
Senior people.
There's 10 senior people. So all of these could be the specific elements of what your imposter syndrome is. So it's worth looking back at our original episodes just to see if any of those, if this has sparked a kind of a chord with you and you're like, oh gosh, yeah, this is something I struggle with. Maybe you want something else. That is a good resource as well. Kind of another 20-minute or so podcast to listen to.
So that's it for this week on imposter syndrome. I hope you found that useful and interesting, and I hope it helps you. I can't think of a way of saying being less of an imposter.
Yeah, that sounds really bad, doesn't it?
Being more real, is that a thing?
Yeah, not letting your kind of confidence and imposter syndrome hold you back at work.
There you go. That's what I was going to say next. Brilliant. Next week we're going to do a slightly different podcast. Next week, we find it really interesting to know the different topics and areas that listeners would find it useful for us to discuss. And some of the previous episodes have come from requests or suggestions. And what we thought we would do next week is curate loads of questions on your career conundrums and have a go at answering them during the podcast. So a bit basically like an agony aunt style column that you get in kind of magazines, but all about careers. So if you have a question you want us to discuss, a problem, a challenge, something you'd just like to hear us talk about, you want to put us on the spot, I suppose slightly less on the spot because we'll know beforehand, but as close as you can get to putting us on the spot, please do submit your ideas on Instagram, on Twitter. You can email us at getintouch@amazingif.com, messages on LinkedIn, whichever kind of works for you, but just let us know what your career conundrum is that you'd like us to discuss, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. If we're overwhelmed because this is such a great idea that everyone submits millions of ideas, don't laugh like that.
Part 2.
If we have 2, we'll just take a long time on both of those. They can have 10 minutes each. If we have none, we'll make some up. But please do let us know, because we always find it really interesting, and we hope that if you've got a career conundrum, a bit like we were saying earlier, the likelihood is somebody else has got it as well. So let us know over the next week. Please do keep following us on Instagram, keep giving us your feedback. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to getting your career conundrums through. I think that's it. Thank you so much again for listening, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.